So I think that you should be able to recognize water hemlock even in the wintertime, and here's why. If you didn't know, water hemlock is one of the deadliest plants on the planet. So first, maybe you're a parent and you would just like to know if it's growing somewhere that your kids could accidentally get to it. I totally understand that. Or maybe you are a forager like me. How does it benefit us? Well, late fall to early spring is actually a really great time to be foraging for roots and tubers. But before I could recognize these plants, I just always had this fear that somehow I would accidentally gather a water hemlock or another of its poisonous cousins without knowing it. So in this video, I'm going to show you the easiest details that you can use to recognize water hemlock and one of its other deadly cousins. And then we'll compare it to an edible lookalike, wild carrot. But first, I want to tell you about an incredibly dangerous piece of bad foraging advice that I see referenced all the time about these plants. Here is a root of wild carrot, the edible one. And if I scratch into it, then it releases that nice, pleasant carrot aroma that we're all familiar with. And what people say is that that aroma alone distinguishes it as the edible one, which is simply not true. I've smelled the root of water hemlock, which smells like carrot, as well as other deadly members of the carrot family that have a carrot aroma to varying degrees. So please don't ever use a variable thing like aroma alone to distinguish an edible plant from a deadly one. That is dangerous advice and someone is bound to get hurt from it. So with that, I want to show you the actual details that you can use to definitively distinguish them. And for this video, I am going to be covering as many details as I can because I think that the subject is important and that it warrants it. But I just wanted to let you know that you don't have to worry about memorizing all of them because I've put them all in these downloadable guides here for you. And I'll tell you more about that later on in the video. For now, let's take a look at water hemlock. I'm literally recording this under a bridge, so there's water dripping down and then the car's passing over. Hopefully we don't get too much of the road noise, but we'll see. One of the first things that my eyes are drawn to is the compound umbels, and some of them still have the seeds that are attached to them. If you were to gather and crush the seeds, they will release a relatively strong carrot aroma. You can see in some of the shots that I'm handling the plant with my bare hands, but some caution is advised. I'll be sure to wash my hands before I eat my lunch. At the very least, when it comes to the seeds and especially the root of water hemlock, they're likely just as poisonous as any other time of the year. The dried pinnately compound leaves sometimes persist into the winter, clinging onto the stems, but they usually go away pretty quickly. However, they will leave behind the base of a sheath-like attachment where they were. All right, now we're at the stems. And these to me give us some of the more distinctive characteristics of water hemlock. They are generally orange to brown in color, but sometimes grayish. And what's more striking is the vertical striations that run along the full length of the stems. Additionally, if you were to make a cut into them, you would see that they are completely hollow on the inside. The problem is, so far, a lot of the details that we've covered also apply to wild carrot, which has a compound umbel, vertical striations, and pinnately compound leaves that sometimes cling to the stems. So, what can we use to distinguish them? Well, of course, environment does play a role. You aren't likely to find water hemlock in a dry area that doesn't have any water. Although the poisonous cousin doesn't mind dry conditions at all. So first, let's take a look at the distinguishing details of wild carrot. You've probably heard the saying before, the queen has hairy legs, which comes from Queen Anne's lace, which is another name for wild carrot, which are hairy, while water hemlock or poison hemlock are hairless. You should still be able to see the hairs on the stems or bumps that are left behind them. And if you can see the hairs, they're usually going to be thin and wispy at this point. Because they or the bumps are present, if you run your fingers over the stem, they should feel rough to the touch. Whereas water hemlock will feel very smooth. I'm going to play some audio for you to see if you can hear the difference between running my hands over the stems of wild carrot versus running my hands over the stem of water hemlock. You hear that? It's subtle, but it's there. It's pretty cool. Water hemlock also usually grows much taller with thicker stems than wild carrot does. Wild carrot can, but rarely grows above 4 feet in height. I think these ones are probably right around that range. And they usually have a base stem diameter that's below 1/2 inch compared to water hemlock, which can grow up to 7 feet in height and with a base stem diameter that's usually above ½ an inch. Also, remember, water hemlock stems are hollow, and most of the parts of wild carrot stems are filled with a spongy pith. When looking, I have found some parts that are hollow, but for the most part, they are spongy. If you are sampling a suspected water hemlock for the stem hollowness, just make sure to take a portion that is larger in diameter. Sometimes the inner part of a smaller stem can appear like it's sponge-filled when it's actually hollow. The flowers, and thus the seed heads of wild carrot, are much denser than water hemlock. You'll see this reflected in the spent seed heads as well. Additionally, wild carrot seed heads usually curl in on themselves much more than water hemlock does. So even if a few of the stems of the compound umbel are sticking out, you'll usually come across the wild carrot seeds bunched up in the middle in some way. A really important and a really cool distinguishing feature between them is that wild carrot seeds have tiny lines of spines on them, and they'll look visibly hairy, compared to water hemlock seeds that are smooth overall. They don't have that characteristic. Another saying for wild carrot is that the queen has a skirt, referring to what's called a bract that is underneath the flower head in the summertime. It's an important identification characteristic. However, in the middle of winter, that bract usually folds upwards into the seed head, and it may not look like they're present at all. I also want to note that I had a lot more trouble than I thought I would finding wild carrot specimens in the wintertime for this video. I think that in general, they don't persist this far into the season that well. All right, now to talk about the last one, the details of an additional poisonous cousin that grows in drier areas, and the one that you're more likely to mistake for wild carrot if you ask me. They all look kind of similar in the winter, but in the summer, this one is closer to wild carrot and the roots come into play. More on that in a second. I did just want to mention that there is a lot of nuance to this subject of foraging for carrot family members that I feel I can't properly capture entirely in this video alone. So I've done a full write-up in an article on my website. The link is in the description, and that's also where you can find the link to get those downloadable guides. With that, let's talk about poison hemlock, Conium maculatum. Now, it's pretty obvious why you'd want to be able to distinguish this one from wild carrot, but I'm going to show you why you might also want to be able to distinguish it from water hemlock. And here is the poison hemlock right here. In the wintertime, honestly, this one and water hemlock can be pretty hard to tell apart visually. They have similarly spaced seed heads, they grow to a similar height, and they both have hollow stems. What I would go by is that poison hemlock will grow in a dry, well-drained area, and it usually has a little bit more of a splotchy remnant pattern on its stems. Last, the root doesn't go out in every direction like water hemlock does. Actually, the root patterning of water hemlock there is also different from wild carrot, something that I didn't get to mention before. Poison hemlock is extremely cold hardy. If the weather ever starts to warm up a little bit in the wintertime, you'll see a bunch of young plants coming up, and of course, all of them are hairless. The reason why I think it's important that you should be able to distinguish poison hemlock from water hemlock is that while water hemlock is a native species, and I see no reason why you should go out of your way to remove it, poison hemlock is a fast-spreading invasive species from Eurasia. You should try to remove it, safely, of course, if you can. But everything that we've covered so far is just half the picture, because you really need to be able to distinguish them when they're at the rosette stage in the springtime. As soon as that season hits, I will make the video for you. If it's done, it'll show up next to me right now, and if not, then you can subscribe so that you don't miss it.